Imagine this. You are a queen. You rule over thousands. Armies bow to you. Nations fear your name. And then one morning, Roman soldiers kick open your palace doors, chain your wrists in gold turned iron, and drag you across the Mediterranean Sea. Not to kill you. No, that would be too quick. They want something worse. They want to walk you through the streets of Rome like a pet animal, while a million people throw rotten food at your face. That was the Roman triumph. And what happened to captured queens inside that ceremony is one of the most disturbing chapters in all of ancient history. Rome conquered over 50 major kingdoms between 300 BC and 100 AD. That is a lot of royal families dragged out of their homes. And the women in those families? The queens, the princesses, the wives of defeated kings? Rome had a very specific system for them. A system designed not just to punish, but to humiliate, to erase, and sometimes to destroy. So let us talk about it. Let us talk about what Roman generals actually did to captured queens. And trust me, the real history is worse than any movie you have ever seen. First, you need to understand the Roman triumph. This was not just some victory parade. This was the single biggest event in Roman public life. Bigger than elections, bigger than gladiator fights. When a general won a major war, the Senate could vote to grant him a triumph. And if they did, Rome basically shut down for a day. Here is how it worked. The general would ride into the city on a golden chariot pulled by 4 white horses. Behind him marched his entire army. Thousands of soldiers carrying treasure, weapons, and paintings of the battles they won. The streets would be packed. Historians estimate that during major triumphs, between 500,000 and over 1 million spectators lined the route from the Campus Martius through the Forum and up to the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. The whole route was about 3 to 4 kilometers long. But the real attraction was not the gold. It was the prisoners. Right in front of the general's chariot, they would march the captured enemy leaders, kings, generals, princes, and queens. They walked in chains, sometimes heavy iron chains, sometimes golden chains if the general wanted to show off how wealthy the enemy had been. The prisoners wore their own royal clothing on purpose. Rome wanted the crowd to see that these were not random slaves. These were powerful rulers brought to their knees. The crowd did not just watch, they participated. Roman writers like Plutarch and Livy describe how spectators would shout insults, throw things, and mock the prisoners as they stumbled through the streets. Some processions lasted an entire day. Pompey's triumph in 61 BC reportedly stretched over 2 full days. Imagine being a queen, walking for hours through a hostile city of 1 million screaming strangers while chained and exhausted. And at the end of the parade route, at the Temple of Jupiter, the captured kings and military leaders were often taken to the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison. Many were executed there by strangulation. Right at the moment when the general was offering sacrifices and the crowd was cheering upstairs, the enemy leaders were being killed in a dark cell below. Not all of them were killed. Some queens survived. But surviving was not always the better option. Let us talk about the most famous case. Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra. If you do not know her story, you should. Zenobia was one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. Around 269 AD, she took control of the Palmyrene Empire, which covered modern-day Syria, Egypt, and parts of Turkey. At her peak, she controlled roughly 1/3 of the Roman Empire's eastern territory. That is massive. She commanded armies. She declared independence from Rome. She even minted her own coins with her face on them. Rome was not going to let that slide. Emperor Aurelian personally led the campaign against her. In 272 AD, after a series of brutal battles near Antioch and Emesa, Roman forces finally captured Palmyra. Zenobia tried to flee east toward Persia on a camel. Roman cavalry caught her at the Euphrates River before she could cross. Now here is where it gets dark. Aurelian brought Zenobia back to Rome for his triumph in 274 AD. Ancient historians describe the scene in detail. Zenobia was forced to walk through the streets of Rome in golden chains. Not regular chains, gold ones. The historian Trebellius Pollio writes that the chains were so heavy she could barely walk. She had to stop and rest multiple times during the procession. Some accounts say servants had to help hold up the chains so she could keep moving. She was also reportedly dressed in her finest royal robes and covered in jewels. This was deliberate. Aurelian wanted Rome to see just how rich and powerful this woman had been. And now look at her, stumbling, chained, finished. But here is the twist. Zenobia was not executed. Unlike many captured rulers, she actually survived the triumph. According to most historical accounts, Aurelian gave her a villa in Tibur, modern-day Tivoli, about 30 kilometers from Rome. She apparently lived out the rest of her life there as a Roman matron, possibly even remarrying into a Roman senatorial family. That sounds merciful, right? Think about it differently. Her empire was destroyed. Palmyra was sacked. Her legacy was turned into a Roman victory story. That is a different kind of cruelty, the kind that lets you live long enough to watch everything you built disappear. Now let us talk about the queen who saw this coming and chose death instead. Cleopatra VII of Egypt is probably the most famous queen in all of history. She ruled Egypt for about 21 years, from 51 BC to 30 BC. She was incredibly smart. She spoke at least 9 languages, according to Plutarch. She was one of the richest people on the planet. Egypt's annual revenue under her rule was estimated at around 12,500 talents of silver. For context, the entire Roman Republic's annual income was roughly 10,000 talents at the time. Egypt was making more money than Rome. Cleopatra had romantic and political alliances with 2 of the most powerful Romans who ever lived. First, Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. When Antony and Cleopatra lost the Battle of Actium against Octavian in 31 BC, everything fell apart fast. Antony killed himself with his own sword, and Cleopatra was left to face Octavian alone. Here is what most people do not know. Octavian did not want to kill Cleopatra. He desperately wanted to capture her alive. Why? Because he wanted her for his triumph. Octavian wanted to march the legendary Queen of Egypt through the streets of Rome in chains. That would have been the greatest spectacle Rome had ever seen. It would have cemented his power forever. Cleopatra knew this. She absolutely knew what was waiting for her in Rome. She had heard the stories of other captured queens. She understood the humiliation, and she decided she would rather die than give Octavian that satisfaction. In August of 30 BC, Cleopatra reportedly killed herself, most famously said to be by the bite of an asp, though historians debate the exact method. Cassius Dio suggests it may have been a poisoned hairpin. Whatever the method, she was 39 years old. Octavian was reportedly furious. He even brought in snake charmers called Silly to try to suck the venom out of her body and revive her. It did not work. So instead, for his triumph in 29 BC, Octavian had a golden statue of Cleopatra made, complete with an asp on her arm, and paraded that through the streets instead. Think about what that tells you. The fact that a queen chose death over the triumph tells you exactly how terrible that experience was. Cleopatra was a survivor. She had navigated Roman politics for over 2 decades. She outlasted Caesar's assassination, multiple civil wars, and betrayals. And yet she looked at the Roman triumph and said, "No, I would rather die." That should tell you everything. Zenobia and Cleopatra get all the attention, but there were dozens of other queens who went through this. Let me tell you about some you have probably never heard of. First, Sophonisba. She was a Carthaginian noblewoman and queen of Numidia during the Second Punic War around 203 BC. When the Roman-allied Numidian king Massinissa captured her city, he actually fell in love with her and married her on the spot. But the Roman general Scipio Africanus was not having it. He ordered Massinissa to hand Sophonisba over to Rome for the triumph. Massinissa, torn between his love and his Roman alliance, sent Sophonisba a cup of poison instead. She drank it willingly. Another queen who chose death over Roman chains. She was reportedly in her late 20s. Then there is Thusnelda. Her story is maybe the saddest. She was a Germanic princess, the wife of the famous chieftain Arminius, who destroyed 3 Roman legions at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. That battle was one of Rome's worst defeats ever. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed. Arminius became a legend among Germanic tribes. But in 15 AD, Thusnelda was captured by the Roman general Germanicus. She was pregnant at the time. She was taken to Rome and displayed at the triumph of Germanicus in 17 AD. Her son, Thumelicus, was born in Roman captivity. The historian Tacitus describes how Thusnelda walked through the Roman streets with her head held high, refusing to cry or show weakness, while her father, Segestes, who had betrayed his own people to Rome, sat watching from the VIP section. Thumelicus, her son, reportedly grew up as a captive in Rome. Some sources suggest he was trained as a gladiator in Ravenna. Imagine that. The grandson of the man who humiliated Rome at Teutoburg Forest, forced to fight for Roman entertainment. We do not know how he died, but it was almost certainly not peaceful. There is also the story of Tuta, queen of the Illyrians. She ruled the Adriatic coast around 231 BC, and her navy was so powerful it threatened Roman trade routes. After Rome defeated her in the First Illyrian War, she was forced to surrender almost all her territory and pay massive tribute. Some ancient sources suggest she eventually took her own life rather than live under Roman domination. Another queen who refused to be a trophy. And then there was Berenice IV of Egypt, who ruled briefly before Cleopatra. When her father, Ptolemy XII, returned to Egypt with Roman military support in 55 BC, he had his own daughter executed. Roman power did not even need to march queens through the streets sometimes. Just the threat of Roman involvement was enough to destroy royal women from the inside out. These stories follow a pattern: capture, humiliation, erasure. Whether the queens lived or died, Rome made sure they were broken as symbols. Their kingdoms were absorbed. Their names were used as Roman propaganda. Their suffering was public entertainment. Now, you might be wondering, why? Why were the Romans so specifically cruel to captured queens? Was it just general brutality? No, it was calculated. Every bit of it was a political strategy. See, Rome understood something about power that most empires did not. They understood that defeating an enemy on the battlefield was not enough. You had to defeat them in people's minds. The triumph was not really about celebrating victory. It was about sending a message to every other kingdom in the world. This is what happens to you if you resist Rome. And queens were the most powerful symbols they could use. Here is why. In the ancient world, queens represented their entire nation's honor. A queen was not just a political leader. She was a symbol of her people's dignity, independence, and identity. When Rome paraded a queen in chains, they were not just humiliating one woman. They were humiliating an entire civilization. The numbers back this up. Between 264 BC and 235 AD, Rome held over 300 recorded triumphs. In the ones where enemy rulers were displayed, the psychological impact was enormous. Conquered peoples would sometimes surrender without fighting just because they heard what happened to other leaders. The deterrent effect was massive. Rome also had specific legal frameworks for this. Under Roman law, captured enemy rulers became part of the spoils of war, legally classified the same as gold, weapons, and livestock. A captured queen was literally property. The general who captured her owned the right to display her. This was codified. It was bureaucratic. There were rules about who got credit for the capture, how the triumph should be organized, and what happened to the prisoners afterward. The Senate had to vote on every triumph. The general had to prove that his war met certain criteria. At least 5,000 enemy soldiers had to have been killed in a single battle. According to the historian Valerius Maximus, the war had to be against a foreign enemy, not a civil war. and the general had to have held supreme command. This meant that the humiliation of captured queens was not some random act of cruelty. It was an approved, government-sanctioned public spectacle. Some generals even competed over who could put on the most impressive triumph. Pompey the Great's triumph in 61 BC featured so much treasure that it took 2 days to process through the city. Julius Caesar's quadruple triumph in 46 BC included prisoners from 4 different wars. The sister of Cleopatra, Arsinoe IV, was displayed in Caesar's triumph, and the Roman crowd actually felt sorry for her because she was young and visibly terrified. That is one of the rare cases where public sympathy went against the general's propaganda. But even that sympathy did not save Arsinoe. She was eventually executed on the orders of Mark Antony a few years later, reportedly at Cleopatra's request, while she was living in sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Even temples were not safe from Roman reach. So what happened to the queens who survived the triumph? Where did they go? The honest answer is, we usually do not know. And that silence tells you a lot. For most captured royal women, history simply goes quiet after the triumph. They disappear from the records. They were absorbed into Roman society as slaves, concubines, or in rare cases, freed women with limited rights. Their royal titles meant nothing. Their bloodlines were erased. Their children, if they had any, were raised Roman. Zenobia is the exception because she was given a relatively comfortable life. But even her story ends in ambiguity. We know she lived in Tivoli. We think she married a Roman senator. After that, nothing. The most powerful woman in the Eastern Mediterranean just fades from history like she never existed. Some captured royal women were given as rewards to Roman officers. Others were sold into slavery at public auctions. The prices for royal slaves were extremely high because of their novelty value. Owning a former queen was a status symbol among wealthy Romans. The children of captured royals often had the worst fate. Boys were sometimes raised to be client kings, puppet rulers that Rome could install in their parents' former kingdoms. Girls were married off to Roman allies. In both cases, the goal was the same: turn the bloodline into a Roman tool. Use the family's legitimacy to control the conquered territory without spending military resources. This is what makes Rome's treatment of queens different from other ancient empires. The Persians often treated captured royalty with respect. Alexander the Great famously treated the captured family of the Persian king Darius III with honor, even raising his children in a privileged environment. The Chinese had complex systems of tributary relationships that preserved royal dignity. Rome had no interest in preserving anyone's dignity. The whole point was to destroy it, publicly, permanently, and then use what was left for practical purposes. Now you might be thinking, this was 2,000 years ago. Why does this matter? It matters because we still celebrate Rome. We name our buildings after Roman architecture. Our legal systems are based on Roman law. Our governments are modeled on the Roman Republic. We call our legislative buildings capitals after Capitoline Hill, the same hill where captured queens were dragged in chains. But we rarely talk about the human cost. The queens I told you about today are not footnotes. They were real people with real lives who were systematically destroyed for political spectacle. Zenobia was a mother. Cleopatra was a genius administrator. Thusnelda was pregnant when she was captured. Sophonisba was in her 20s when she drank poison rather than face Rome. History has a habit of remembering the winners and forgetting the victims. We know every detail of the generals' careers. We can name every triumph. But the queens? Most of them do not even have Wikipedia pages. Over the course of Roman history, hundreds of royal women from Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia were captured, displayed, and erased. Some were queens of kingdoms that had existed for centuries before Rome was even founded. Their entire civilizations were reduced to a single afternoon's entertainment in a Roman parade. And we built the modern world on top of that legacy. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it is